Hi, I'm Debbie Shaw, and in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make this handy craft bag which will hold your cutting mat, a lot of your tools and rulers, and it's perfect to take to workshops or just to hang up at the back of your door at home. Now, you have seen me making these mats before. There's a very similar one in my Sewing Room Accessories book. There's quite a basic one here on YouTube, but this one's got a lot more pockets, and it's something that you can make to measure to the size of the mat that you have yourself. So I'll give you the measurements for my mat, which is quite a small one. You could make smaller if you have an A5 size mat. You could make larger if you had an A3, and of course it doesn't have to be for a cutting mat. You can just use this to keep your tools in. So this bag has pockets across the front which have gussets in them. It has a zip pocket on the back. So if you are going to classes, you can keep things that might spill out on there, your loose change or mobile phone and things like that. And that's all lined as well. It fastens with a magnetic snap. And inside, I've actually made an elasticated pocket as well, so I can keep bigger things in there, or maybe reels of thread and ribbon and lace and things like that. So I think you'll find it a very simple bag to make, but a very useful bag to make as well. So let's take a look at the materials that you need, and then let's get sewing. So this is the size of my cutting mat, and you can see I've cut the fabric a little bit larger all the way around and more at the top than at the bottom. So when my mat sits inside the bag, it's going to sit quite close to the bottom here. I've already fused my foam onto the wrong side of the outer fabric. And a fusible foam, I use a Bosal. It's around about 1/4 inch thick, which gives the bag a little bit of sturdiness, so it'll almost stand up on its own, but it's still pliable and it's still soft enough to sew through. So it makes it easy to work with. I don't normally trim the seams back, but I'm going to put a zip into one side of this, so I will trim the foam back up to the seam just to make it a little bit easier to turn that around. But with the shape of the bag, I want to make it so that the corners of my mat just poke out of the top. So I'm going to chop off the corners of the fabric. So let's measure and mark that first of all. And I'm going to take my mark 5 inches from each side, and I'm just using an air erasable pen to mark this. You could use chalk or a pencil, it doesn't really matter. And I'm going to go 4 inches down the side. And then I'll draw a line from one of those marks to the other. And then I'll cut straight across. And then I'll need to repeat that on the second of the outer piece and on both lining pieces as well. But I can use this first piece as a template, so I don't need to measure every single piece. So again, just draw on the line. And cut. And then the same with the lining pieces. I'll do these both together. So I'll place my outer piece over the top, matching up the sides, draw the line, and cut. Now, as I said earlier, you can add as many pockets as you like. You can put patch pockets on the front, zip pockets on the back, more zip pockets on the inside, however many you feel you're going to find useful. But I'm going to put my zip pocket on the outer side of my bag first of all. So I've cut 2 pieces of fabric which measure 13 inches by 8 inches. And if you're making a different size of bag, you may want to make a different size of pocket. So a smaller bag could have a smaller pocket, a larger bag will have a larger pocket. So take one of the lining pieces and your ruler. So if this is the top of my pocket, I'm going to draw a box, and I'm going to take that 1.5 inches from the top, so the top of my line is going to be 2 inches from the end and 1/2 inch deep. You might have seen these type of zips I do as pockets before. I put them on several of my bags. I just find they're so easy to do. I call them a letterbox zip, but I'm sure there's a professional name for it. But the way that it works reminds me of a letterbox or a post box because of the shape of it and the way that you post your fabric through when you've finished. So I've got a rectangular shape here. I'm going to draw a line straight down the centre. And then just make that into a little Y shape at each short end. This then goes onto the front of my bag. I can use my ruler again to make sure that I'm the same distance from each side. So a little bit further over that way. That's it. I'll just remeasure. This doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, but as it's on the outside of the bag, it is nice to have it as centrally as you can. There. So I've set that to about 2 inches from the bottom of the bag. So we'll have a few pins in here just to hold it all together. And again, your foam's quite easy to pin into. Long pins help. And then I'm going to use a small stitch on my sewing machine, so 2.2, and I'm going to sew around the outside of the box all the way around through all layers of fabric. Always stop with your needle down when you're pivoting, so you know you're going to carry on with your stitch line in exactly the right place. Just chop off that extra thread. Down the final side. And I'm just coming back up to where I started sewing, so my stitches meet. Then I can take out my pins. And now we're going to cut straight through the centre, so along that centre line and into the corners. So I've got quite a lot of fabric to cut through, so persevere. Nice sharp scissors. So I'm just making a hole to start with. And then cut straight down the centre. When I come up to the V shape, I'm going to cut as far into the stitches as I can without actually cutting through. Don't want to cut through the stitches, so you have to start all over again. So back into the second side. and into the corners. Now at this point, this may be a little bit fiddly, but I am going to open up that seam and trim back, let's do it from this side, trim back some of the foam. Not too close to the stitches, so maybe about 1/8 of an inch. So I'm just folding the fabric out of the way, so it's just the foam I'm cutting. And that'll help to reduce the bulk. I'm not going to do that in the seams around the edge. I'm just doing this around the zip. But again, not through the fabric as well, because I don't want to weaken the seam. I just want to make it less bulky. And then along the second side here. Almost there. So I have the iron on at this point because we're going to press this in just a second. Right. So this is why I call it a letterbox zip. So there's the outside that I've just sewn. I find the easiest way to do this is to actually press the lining away from the hole to start with. Like so. And then we're going to post the lining fabric through the hole. And that'll leave me a nice neat gap to put my zip behind. So now I'm bending this over so that the edge here is right on the seam. And press. Now I'm using quite a hot iron. If you're using Bosal foam, it will easily take a hot iron, as long as your fabric that you're ironing onto will as well. And in fact, to attach the foam to the back of your fabric, lots of steam with this one as well. But do check your manufacturer's instructions, because if you're using a different brand, then that may vary. So good old press. Use a bit of steam if you like. If you find that your fabric is really fighting back, then a bit of spray starch will do the trick to help hold it in place. There, so now nice and neat on the outside. I've pressed up to the seam. It still wants to bounce back a little bit, but now I'm going to sew around the edge. So I can lengthen the stitch on my machine a little bit. I'm going to go up to 2.5 now. And then a nice neat stitch all the way around the edge. And you're going to see this one, so try and keep it as neat and straight as you can. So as I'm going, I'm still going to keep kind of bending the seam back so it sits right on the edge. Don't worry if you get a little tiny bit of the lining fabric coming through. It could actually give a nice outline, but we don't want to make the gap that the zip's going in too small. So again, just pulling this out of the way, keeping the seam flat until I'm back to the beginning. Now normally when I'm doing a zip like this, I'd put the zip on before sewing like this, so I'm actually going to go around twice. And the reason for that is I really want to keep that Bosal out of the way and keep the gap around here nice and neat. So I'm literally going to put the zip into the back and sew over the top of the same stitches. If you're just using regular fabric, and you're inserting this type of zip, or if you're using a lighter weight of interfacing such as Valiseline H640, which is another one of my favourites, that's a fusible fleece, there's no need to do this step first. This is purely because that foam that's on the inside of here really wanted to bend back up again, and I think that's going to make it quite difficult to then put the zip over the top. So that's why we're doing two procedures, if you like. So I find the easiest way to hold the zips in place, and I know my zip is far too long, that's always the case. I have a stack of zips that are too long for most projects because I always think there's very little difference in price in the length of zips, and I'd rather have something that's too long that I can cut down to size than have a whole drawer full of zips that are too short, because you can't make them any longer. So that's my thinking. So I'm going to use a Prim aqua marker, which is a fabric glue stick, to hold this in place. If you like to use quilter's tape, then that would work just as well. If you don't want to use either, then I would hand tack this before sewing. Whether that's on the thicker foam or not, I'd always hand tack or baste in some kind of manner to hold your zip in place first, because you'll find it very difficult on something like this to sew around pins. So I'm going to open the zip slightly and place it with the slider side down over the top of the gap, and just pinch the ends of the zip so that they meet and give it a squish. Turn it over and just make sure that the coil of the zip is sitting straight down the centre. You can see it's opened up a little bit here, so I can still manoeuvre that around so the ends pinch together. Don't worry about bits of glue like this getting on your fabric. You can just take a damp sponge and wipe those away. It is designed for fabric, so don't worry about this type of glue gunging up your sewing machine or spoiling your fabric. This is what it's actually been designed for. So I'm just going to leave that a few seconds until the glue really adheres, and then I'll start with the zip open and sew around again. So you don't actually need a zipper foot on your sewing machine. Didn't wait quite long enough for that one to dry. But if you prefer, you can. If you're used to using a zipper foot, then that's absolutely fine. So back under we go. And I'm just literally going to stitch around the same stitch line that I've just made. It's almost a free motion kind of look to your zip, which is quite unusual. If you've got a heavily patterned fabric like this, then it doesn't really matter. But if you are sewing onto a plain fabric, then try and be really precise with your stitch line. Or of course, the first set of stitches that you made, if you want this to be really neat, you can unpick those afterwards, so treat those as basting stitches or tacking stitches. Okay, so that is my zip in. I'm just going to cut away the little threads. Turn it over, and I'm going to trim the zip back to just before the part where it's sewn in. So you can see there, it's still a little bit too long, so let's trim that back. Then we need to pop on the second half of the pocket. So this goes right side down to the first half, and we're going to sew just through the fabric, so not through the foam bit on this occasion. So let's pin these pieces together without going through the foam. Stitch length down a little bit again. I'll go down to 2.4. And then literally I'm going to sew around the edge of the pocket, but folding the bag out of the way. So I can take a couple of pins out now. Move the bag around again. The actual bag out of the way, so it's just the pocket I'm sewing. And I can take the next pin out. Never sew over your pins. If you can possibly avoid it, don't sew over pins. I know a lot of people do, and to be honest, if I've ever hit a pin by accident, it's not been a problem. But you never know where the ends of the pin are going to fly off to, which is always a concern if you do break one. So again, let's just line up those edges. It went a little bit wobbly there. the corner and then back down the final side. So that's the back of my bag, and there's the front of my bag, and so no stitching from the pockets on there at all, but you can see the lining behind there, so that's quite a nice look, I think, for your bag. So the second half of my bag, I'm going to have a long patch pocket across the front of here. So I've cut 2 pieces of fabric, and these are obviously longer than the actual bag, so they're 6 inches deep, and those measure 28 inches across. And I'm going to sew the 2 long sides together to make a tube. And that'll be right sides together. So just sew across the top and across the bottom. Excellent. Then let's turn this the right side out. And press it. So I'm just squishing this so that one seam's on the top and one's on the bottom, and give it a press. That's the dog playing with biscuits. And you. Hello. Hello. Not eating them, just playing with them. She likes to throw them around. Again, a little bit of spray starch may help because we haven't got any wadding or interfacing on this one, so it's quite a soft pocket. You could put a little bit of fusible interfacing or stabiliser on the back if you wish. I wouldn't do anything padded like a fusible foam or wadding, but if you wanted to put some interfacing on, if your fabric is very fine, it may help it to keep its shape. Okay, so my pocket is going to go straight across the centre here. And you can see how this is much longer than the actual bag, and there is a reason for that. So let's measure 3 inches from the bottom, just making sure that the pocket's straight. And again, we'll have a few pins to hold that in place. So I'm just going to pin in the centre for now, just so it doesn't slip. Then I can decide where I want my pockets to be. So the first thing I'm going to do is to draw a line straight down the centre. So again, where did I put my pen? On the floor. So I'm using a red pen, you probably won't be able to see this very well. And I'm going to mark the centre of my bag, which is here. So I'm going to draw a line straight down the centre here, and sew along there first of all. Then I can decide how big I want my pockets to be either side. So always when you're sewing pockets like this, go backwards and forwards over the top, just a couple of times, just to strengthen the top of the seam. So there's one side. Let's just snip off that thread. And then I'm going to make a fold for my first pocket. So I'm simply going to fold the edge of this over by about 1/2 inch or 1 centimetre and pop a pin in there. and do the same on the other side. So I've got a gusset. And keep this again nice and straight with that 3-inch gap towards the bottom, and I can give that a quick press. Then I'm going to make a second pocket. I think I'm just going to have 4, so I'm going to do a line here, but I need to make that gusset shape first of all. So again, fold over by about 1/2 inch, and just FYI, that pocket is 4 inches across. Then we'll have another little fold on this side. And that's going to be it for my pocket. So let me put a pin in here to hold that one in place. And then I'll do the same on the other side. So after 4 inches, again, a little fold and iron. You can make these a lot smaller. You could have them flat if you prefer. You could make pen pockets by making very small little pockets. You will need to put some kind of divider down there though, otherwise your pockets, if it's just one big long one, it's just going to flop over at the front. That won't look very good and it won't hold anything. Okay, so let's again make sure that this is sitting straight. It needs to come down a bit. So this time I'm going to sew across the centre here. So not through the folded bits, but right down the centre in between them. And the same on the final pocket here. And then before I take my pins out, I'm going to sew straight across the bottom. So when I come up to those pleats, make sure that they're folded as you press them in the right directions. Just make sure that's meeting. And I'm just going to turn over to the wrong side and just make a little row of stitches really close to the edge just to hold the ends of the pocket in place. So there's my pockets. I can now take out my pins. And trim off the edge. There. So now I've got pockets, the 2 pockets in the middle with a little bit of room in them. But they're not so wide that they're going to fall forward, so they're actually rather practical pockets. So we've got a zip pocket on the one side, we've got the patch pockets on the opposite side. On the inside of the bag, I'm going to have an elasticated pocket. It's like a whole pocket tutorial, this, isn't it? So this is the fabric that I'm using for the pocket on the inside. And this measures up at 12 inches by 8 inches. What I want to do is to make the top of the pocket 12 inches and the bottom of the pocket 8 inches. So I've got the 2 pieces together and I'm just going to measure on my mat 2 inches from the side here. So I don't need to mark that. I can literally put my ruler over the top, measure in 2 inches and have the ruler at the top left hand corner and cut. And then do the same on the opposite side. Normally stand up when I'm rotary cutting because you can put more pressure on it. So I didn't go through all the layers first time. Then do the same on the opposite side here. There we go. What I need to do now is to just straighten off the end here. So at the moment it's going to a point, and I want it to go to a square. So I'm just going to trim this end back by about 1 inch. You'll see why in just a second when we put the elastic in. Like so. And then I'm going to sew these right sides together just across the top. So just across this section with a 1/4 inch or a 5mm seam allowance. And then I'll fold this over to the right side and give it a press. Then take your elastic, and I'm going to sew one end of the elastic just to one side of the pocket here and push it right up against the seam. So just sew your elastic in place just across here. Okay. And then with the right sides of the pocket together, we're going to sew down the sides, not across the bit where the pocket is here. So your seam will start just under the pocket, just under the elastic, sorry. So down the sides and then leave a turning gap in the bottom so I can turn it the right side out. So I don't want to trap the other end of the elastic inside the pocket. So I can move that out of the way. Do a little back stitch and sew. I have this with that. Then I'm going to snip off the corners just at the bottom, just to cut down on the bulk, and then we'll turn it the right side out. So let's turn the whole of this out. So my hand's big enough to go inside the hole, or the hole's big enough to take my hand. And then let's take the elastic, and I can feel that underneath the seam. And I'm just going to push it through the hole on this side. Tweezers may help to open it up a little bit here. So again, I'm just going to make sure the elastic isn't twisted. And it's pushed up against that seam at the top. And then I'm going to sew a channel just underneath where the elastic is, so I can feel where that is. Just pulling this corner out. That's it. So I don't want to touch the elastic. You could, if you prefer, actually leaving the elastic till the last minute and then feeding it through using something like a safety pin or a big bodkin on the end. So you don't have to put the elastic in this way. I just find it's quite an easy way of doing it. but I'm not going to gather it just yet. We'll do that when it's on the bag. All right, so snip away my loose threads again. So the elastic at this point I can pull through freely, but again, not yet. So let's press the pocket again. When I come to pressing the bottom, I'm just going to fold those raw edges inside to make a nice neat line here. And I'm not going to sew over that because when I put the pocket onto the bag, then that's going to close anyhow. And then we'll put this one in place on the lining. So there's my lining in the same shape as the outer bag. This is just going to go on the one side. I'm not putting pockets on the other side, but you could if you wanted to. And we're going to sit this right in the centre. So again, we'll measure about 3 inches from the bottom and just make sure that the bottom is sitting evenly to each side, which it is. And I'm just going to put a couple of pins in the bottom. It's only the bottom I'm going to sew at the moment. You'll see why in a second. So, oops, quite close to the edge, making sure the opening is folded over so it closes as you sew. So we have this, and what I want to do now is to bring in the sides so this is a right angle. So just do the side at the moment where the elastic's sewn in. And again, just sew that in place. And do a few backward stitches at the top again, just to make that a nice strong seam. Now we're going to pull the elastic. So we need this pocket to be at right angles also. So let's pop a pin in here. So that's a nice square pocket. And then we're going to pull the elastic across the top. Just so it sits nice and flat, so keep adjusting it until it's pulled tight enough like that to hold its shape, but not so tight that it's going to gather up the lining. So that's perfect. So I'm going to pin through the elastic so it doesn't pop back out again, and then just sew down this edge. And again, do a couple of backward stitches over the elastic just to make sure that it's nice and secure. And then we can cut off the end of the elastic. I'm going to peel back a little bit of that seam allowance so that the end of the elastic disappears inside. So I've got a nice neat edge there. So now you can see I've got quite a deep pocket that I can put things in on the inside of my bag. Next thing I'm going to do is put a magnetic snap on here. So that's how my bag's going to fasten. So I'll need to find the center point. So I'm just going to fold it in half and finger crease the center. And don't put your snap too close to the edge, because remember, you're going to have a seam allowance here. So I normally like to fit mine about 1 inch from the top. So just measure down that crease line and make your mark. Now, because this is the lining fabric and it's not very thick, I'm going to cut just a scrap piece of fabric and put it on the back to strengthen it a little bit. So I'm going to hold this in place with some 505 spray, which is a repositionable spray adhesive. That goes on the back of here. Okay. Then, I know you can't see this too well because I've got red ink on black fabric, but I'm going to put a mark either side. So take the back of your snap. If you've not fitted one of these before, it's ever so easy. Take the back of the snap and place it right over where you want the snap to sit. So over the hole in the centre is over the dot that I coloured in red. Then you're going to draw a little line either side and snip through those lines. So you can either use your quick unpick or a sharp pair of scissors. I normally just fold my fabric in half and make a snip. And then you'll push one side of the snap through it. Make those holes as small as you can, because you can always make a small hole bigger. If you make a hole that's too big, you've got a hole that's too big. And then I'm going to pop the back of the clasp back over those two prongs. And you probably find it easier to squish those prongs outwards than inwards, but it really doesn't matter. Then we'll do the same on the second half of the lining. Whoops. So again, let's fold in half. That just needs trimming back a little bit. I'll do this from the lining side so you'll be able to see a little bit clearer. So I've got my crease line. Again, I'm going to put a little bit of scrap fabric over the back. Let's do that on the pale side so you can see it. So quick spray, lay that over there. Then I'm going to measure 1 inch down the line and draw a dot. Take the back of your snap, place the hole in the centre over the dot. Draw a line each side, and then I like to just fold in half across the dot, make a tiny snip. You need a good pair of scissors, and then the second half of your snap goes through those holes like so. The back goes on and squish the legs open. So when you put the two lining pieces together, they should match perfectly. Now let's put the handles on. So take your outside pieces and we're going to place the handles facing downwards to the top of the bag. Just make that straight. So this is one long piece that I gave you in the measurements that I've simply cut in half. Now this is going to sit about 1/2 inch from the corner here. The reason being, if you put the strap too close to the edge, when you sew the seam around there, it'll throw it out to one side and it won't look very neat. So just sit at about 1/2 inch or 1 centimetre away from that corner edge. Make sure it's not twisted, and bring it back to the opposite side and leave the same kind of gap. And I'm using fabric clips here because they're so much easier than pins. These are made by Clover and they're really useful, not just for thick fabrics like this, but if you're sewing something like a faux leather, a PU or a laminated fabric that you don't want to make holes in with pins. They're really useful. Right, and then I'm just going to sew those in place. So quite close to the edge, this is within the seam allowance, so these are just stitches to hold. while we constrict the rest of the bag. There we go. Then we're going to take our lining pieces and sew right sides together with one of the outer pieces. And we're just going to sew across the top. So again, I'll take a handful of pins, clips, and hold those in place. You can pin through this, it's just a bit thick. Okay, and then I'm just going to sew across the top, so across this side, along here and down here, not across the bottom. Now when you come to the straps, if you wanted to reinforce those a little bit, if you're going to be carrying something heavy, as you sew across the strap, go backwards and then forwards again. You can feel where the strap is. Be careful when you come to the magnetic snap that your foot isn't going to hit the snap, because that could make the stitches go a little bit wobbly. What I'm going to do here, because I've got a really wide foot on my sewing machine, is to move the needle right over to one side. If you do find that the clasp is too close to your seam allowance, you could always put the zipper foot on your sewing machine. That would help. It's just that as you come up to it, you'll feel the lump underneath that, and you don't want your stitches to suddenly go like this. You want them to be kept nice and straight. So again, just coming up to the second strap, going to go backwards and forwards. Turn this around and down the final side. So when I turn this the right side out, I'm not going to snip corners here, I don't think there's need to. I have this, so you can see the way that your bag's going to look. So that's the outside, that's the lining with the elasticated pocket, and there's my snap in the middle. And then we'll do the same with the second two pieces. So there's my outer with the zip pocket on this side. There's my lining. Clip them together, and again just sew around that top section. And there's the second side. So now we need to put the two pieces together. So we're going to start with the outside of the bag and put those right sides together. But we're going to move the lining out of the way and just sew the outer bag. So line up the two side seams here and clip. And we're going to sew right sides together all the way around and finish up here at the second side of the bag. So again, I'm not going to clip all the way around, just on the important bits where the seams meet. I'll move the needle back over to the centre. Just because I find it easier to sew like that. There we go. And starting right on the seam that you've just sewn, we'll sew all the way around. Now when you are sewing through thick layers of fabric like this, that's whether you're quilting or you're bag making, or even things like curtains, you'll find it easier, or with lots of layers of fabric, if you use a walking foot on your sewing machine. So I'll just show you really quickly actually. A standard walking foot will be something like this. So basically you'll need to take off the ankle of your foot. This part sits over the screw that holds the needle in place, and as you're sewing you can see as this is going up and down, so is this going up and down. Let me show that a little bit closer. So there you go. So that goes up and down as these bits go up and down. So it's sometimes called a dual feed foot because this is feeding the fabric through from the top at the same rate as you're feeding it through from the bottom. So it helps to stop your fabric from slipping as you're sewing. My machine's got one built in. So if you're looking at mine thinking, I'm sure Debbie says you should use a walking foot for thick fabrics. I actually am. One of the reasons why the foot is so wide on this machine is because the dual feed action slips into the back of the foot. So right in the corner, then we'll come down the final side and again just lining up the two edges. And then we'll sew the lining. It also runs a little bit slower when you're sewing through thick fabrics. It just does. So now we're going to do the lining in the same way. So we'll move the outer section out of the way. Let's push those back so they're inside out. So that was the outer bit we've just sewn. We're going to move this out of the way, this out of the way, and sew around the lining side. And again, starting and stopping right from that same stitch mark. If you overlap it a little bit, you're going to get a tuck in the fabric. It doesn't matter, you can unpick it. But if you can get it right first time, that's a lot easier. Now this time you'll need to leave a turning gap in the base. So push that foam out of the way, it wants to fight back. And so, pin if you prefer. I'm not going to with this one. Back into the corner and down the final side. And again, as I'm approaching this flap, let's just fold it back out of the way so I can make that seam meet right at the end. Now I am going to snip across the corners here, so not too close to the stitches, but just to cut down a little bit of the bulk as I turn it the right side out. And then we'll turn the whole thing through. If you're making longer handles, by the way, because that's entirely up to you, you could make these to go over your shoulder. Just make sure that you don't sew through the handles when you're sewing the seams. So push them away from the edges if you're going to do that. This kind of length, that doesn't really happen. So let's push out the corners of the outer bag. You may find something like a knitting needle helpful. I tend to use the round end so you don't poke straight through the fabric. And into that side. And then just pull out the handles because that pulls out those corners. Then I'm going to sew over the hole in the middle in the lining. If you pull both sides of the hole away from each other, the hem tends to just roll in. You could sew by hand if you wanted to be really perfect with this and do a ladder stitch so it's invisible. But I don't think anyone's going to be looking this far into the bottom of your bag. There we go. And then I've just got a thread there. Where's my scissors gone? Then we'll push the lining inside the bag. And normally I would give that a good press. And then the final touch is to top stitch all the way around the edge, again with that seam right on the edge, so your bow is going to be folded over, so that's going to be quite chunky again. So again, I need to move my needle right over again because I've got the big foot on there, because I've still got to manoeuvre around those clasps. And then I'm sewing from the inside of my bag. I don't have a free arm on this sewing machine, but if you do have a free arm, take off your accessory compartment and sew from the top side. You might find that easier. Okay, here we go. So I can have a longer stitch here as well, because this isn't a seam. So I'm going to make this up to a length of 3mm and sew all the way around. So there's my bag finished. So again, on the front, I've got the 4 pockets. On the back, I've got a zip pocket, which is all nicely lined as well. On the inside, we fasten with the magnetic snap. And there's my elasticated pocket, so I can put things in there that are maybe a little bit deeper if I wanted to. Better make sure it fits. So let's pop my mat inside and fasten the top. And then in my pockets, I can keep things like my rotary cutters, my glues, maybe if I have, I don't know, some laces and ribbons that I need to keep. I can keep my pens, I can keep my glue sticks, I can keep everything that I need to have at hand. If I've got loose things, maybe buttons and things like that, I can keep them in the back. Or if I'm travelling or going to my, my sewing workshop, I can keep my mobile phone and my cell phone in there. And then on the inside, I've still got plenty of room if I wanted to add rulers and acrylic templates and things like that. So that's my craft bag all finished. I hope you enjoy making yours.